Welcome to the Korea Society's live webcast. I'm Jo, Senior Director of Arts and Culture. Skinship is a breathtaking debut collection of short stories by our guest tonight, Yoon Choi, winner of the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize and named Top 10 Book of the Year by Fresh Air and chosen as one of the best books of the year by NPR and Kirkus Review. This collection of 8 short stories has garnered much praise for its elegant prose and complex characters, and for the writer's unsparing vision and profound understanding of humanity. Yoon Choi was born in Korea and moved to the US at the age of 3. She has an MA from Johns Hopkins University and is a former Stegner Fellow at Stanford University. Her stories and essays have appeared in New England Review, Michigan Quarterly Review, and Narrative Magazine. And her story, The Art of Losing, which is included in this collection, was chosen by Roxane Gay to be included in the Best American Short Stories 2018. Skinship is now out as a paperback, and Yoon Choi joins us from California, where she lives with her family. Welcome to the Korea Society, Yoon. It's so great to have you here, and congratulations on your debut collection.
Thank you, Jay. I'm honored to be here.
So a quick reminder to our viewers, if you have any questions for Yoon, you can send them via email, artsandculture@koreasociety.org, or tweet at Korea Society Art. So I want you to start with the title of the book, which is also the title of one of your short stories, Skinship. I have to make a little confession because I speak Korean. It didn't really dawn on me for a long time that skinship is not really a word used in the normal English vocabulary. It's more like a Korean word. So perhaps this is why that is a perfect title for this collection of 8 short stories, and each one with Korean American or Korean immigrant characters. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, what did this word mean to you? And why did you decide that this particular title will be the title of your debut collection?
So I grew up with the word skinship. My mom used to use it. And for me, it meant just the physical affection that can exist between, at that time, a mom and a child, when you want to, kiss the top of your boy's head, or you want to hold hands with somebody. So it's non-sexual, intimate, physical affection. And so I had a strong connection to the word. And actually Skinship made the OED this year, or maybe it was last year, one of the Korean words that were defined in the OED. So that was kind of exciting for me. I think that as I was researching what the word skinship means, it actually might have come from Japan. So it's a word that they also use in Japan. And it does refer to that physical intimacy, although it might also be like, when K-pop stars kind of hug each other, or, like school children are kind of getting close to one another. So it does have a little bit more of a broad meaning, I think, in the way that it's used. The reason that it's the title of my book collection, though, is because I was told that one-word books are better, like one-word titles are more memorable. So that's how we landed on that. There was one point in the publication process where I emailed my editor and I was like, should we reconsider the title? I'm not sure. And then we kind of landed back on that title. So yeah.
Great. It is certainly a memorable title. So what's really nice about your book about your stories was that it is about, you hear from the point of view of the first generations or the recent immigrants. A lot of the, I think, sort of stereotypical cliched novels about, or stories about sort of the immigrant experience is written from the second generation's point of view, trying to understand their first generation parents or, the generations before them. But you actually tell a lot of stories from their point of view, from the first generation's point of view. And I would imagine that must have been your conscious choice to do that. And so first of all, were you always writing about Korean American experience or those Korean American characters? And why did you decide to tell the stories from their point of view?
So the answer to the latter half of your question is no. When I did my MA at Hopkins, that was right after I did my bachelor's. I went into a writing workshop program, and I did not want to write about the Korean American experience. I felt that it would really speak to my lack of seriousness as a writer. I wanted to identify with like a less culturally specific tradition. And I actually found it very difficult to write about anything at all. So I remember I would even like look at baby name books and be like, what do I name my character? Like Allison, or, like how do I find, or what last name should I give a character? And looking back, it's so surprising to me that I felt so inhibited to write about an experience that was right there in front of me. But I don't think that is an uncommon experience for that particular moment in time. Since then, I think that we're living in an age where publishing has really begun to embrace the immigrant voices that we're hearing. We saw like Jhumpa Lahiri's collection, which came out talking about Bengali Americans in a very natural way. So they didn't seem exotic, they didn't seem foreign, they just seemed like your Bengali American neighbor. And that kind of naturalistic treating, I think, of the immigrant experience was very eye-opening. So that's how I landed on writing about Korean Americans. So when I wrote my first story after a long time not writing at all, I was just raising my kids. The character's name that came to mind was Mose, which is a Korean name, and it was a Korean grandfather who came to mind. Jay, I don't know if it was a conscious decision to occupy first generation narrators, but I do know that as the collection came together, I began to think of the community of Korean Americans that exists in America. And I did make certain very deliberate choices to narrate from different perspectives in that community, and also different locations in that community that are pretty iconic, I think, to the Korean experience. So I did want to be in California near LA. I did want to be in the East Coast tri-state area. And I did want to touch also on certain elements that might be stereotypical and yet are very common in the immigrant experience. So choosing to write about like a small business owner was very meaningful to me, or writing about a child whose parents very much are interested in her education was something that I felt belonged in this collection. So maybe that's how those decisions were made.
Yeah, because you certainly present Korean American characters from all different walks of life. The first story you just mentioned about Mo Se-han is The Arts of Losing, which is told from the point of view of an elderly man with Alzheimer and his wife, who has her own health issues. Then there's a story told from the point of view of a young child who just came to the United States. And then there's also a middle-aged man who is probably on the autism spectrum. And then there's also a Korean American adoptee even. I know you were a third grader at one point, but all these other people obviously are very different from your own life, other than the fact that they are Korean Americans. And what's really nice about is about your collection is that you do really present so many different I don't want to say types but it's just very different experiences of Korean American in the United States. So first of all, I wanted to ask you, what sparks the story for you? What makes you decide to write about, say, a middle-aged classical pianist or a Korean adoptee? Where do you get the inspirations? And I know I don't want to just assume that these are the type of people you knew, or something that you experienced. But how does that story sort of start for you when you start writing?
So the boring answer can sometimes be as easy as the feeling that I've written a lot of third person narrators and now I want a first person. There's like a kind of book craft answer behind certain choices that I make, or I want to write a chronological narrative rather than one that goes too heavily into backstory, something along those lines. The choice to write about the pianist is a little bit of a joke to myself, because I feel that in a collection about Korean Americans, he is a Korean American who doesn't think about the fact that he's Korean American. I think not even once in the story. It just isn't part of his identity. None of the characters or situations in the collection are directly from life. So I don't know any one particular individual or one particular situation that has an exact correspondence. But I think all writers take from what they know in life. And so that could be, a gesture of a character, or it could be some like cool, unforgettable detail that someone has mentioned to you, or it could just be, an idea or concern that's kind of sitting unexplored. And so, for example, with the piano story, I think that I looked around and I saw in my life experience as well, so many people who are so talented, who achieve the most, the person who is valedictorian at Stuyvesant, or, the person who got into Harvard and Juilliard. We know so many of these very high achieving immigrants. And I wondered, what happens to people who have peaked so high when they are so young, and then they're living out the rest of their lives? How do they find new meaning and significance? And it was poignant for me in thinking about piano because it's a performance art, right? And the audience for that performance may or may not be there anymore. So, I think the art of losing, when I was a young mom, I would have these deep concerns that something very terrible was going to happen to one of my kids. It's an irrational concern, but two of them had to do with a pool, like an unguarded pool. And the other, which came, I think, from reading an Alice Munro story many, many years ago, is you back your car out and the kid is behind the car. And there are just these, it's not a real fear, but it's just kind of always in the back of my head, And so I think that probably somewhere in the genesis of the art of losing is the idea of the pool and a child potentially falling inside the water.
Got it. That's really interesting. And you're right. I mean, as parents, you always have some sort of these irrational fears that may not be really, based on reality at all, but you have them and you do feel them very viscerally. So, but I also wanted to ask you about the voice that you captures, because as I said, each character is so very different from one another. And for example, in First Language, the short story, one of the short story, the voice, I don't even know how to describe it, but when you start reading it, even though it's beautifully written, you immediately realize that English is not the first language for this character. And it could be that, just dropping an article here or adding it somewhere, but you just get that so quickly. Like I'm not sure if I can explain it really well, but you just get that sense and you just start hearing that voice, even though you are reading. So I just wanted to ask, again, I guess that's a very craft question, but how do you work to get those voices right? And what's the difference? I'm sure it's not like because you listen to people whose English is not their first language and write it down. There has to be other technical aspect that is involved. But we are also seeing a lot of Korean American writers now writing about Korean characters. And it's always fascinating to me to see how they decide to depict the Korean language in English. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you can tell me a little bit about the choices you had to make to say writing about somebody whose English is not first language in English.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think when I first started writing, that was a huge challenge actually for me because Korean has no English counterpart. I mean, there are multiple things going on. So there are Koreans when they're speaking Korean to one another, right? And how would you transcribe that language? I think if you're actually very literal about it, it has a very interesting sound to it. I think the Korean language and the vocabulary that it accesses is very different from English. I think in many ways it's got a lot of onomatopoeia. It's got a lot of like accidental profundity. I don't know how to explain that better. And so, but when you literally translate it, it looks a little odd and it sounds a little bit odd. And then there's the sound of a Korean speaker speaking in English, which I think is the stereotypical sound that we've heard associated with Asians so much, which I thought needed to be depicted, but in a way that as much as possible could avoid that stereotypical feeling, which I think as a reader would immediately alienate you from the truth of a character. And then there's Konglish, and then there's like the ways that an American speaking younger daughter or son might address his mother. Like there's just so much interesting stuff going on there. And in the beginning, because there weren't so many examples that I had of this kind of writing, it was difficult for me even to figure out how do I signal to the reader these changes? Like even something as simple as she said in English versus she said in Korean, like those little tags, how to play around with that. All of those complications, I think, actually began to energize how I was able to think of a character. So in thinking, a mom wants to tell her daughter, you're so sarcastic. I don't feel like in Korean, a mom would actually use that word in the casual way that an English speaking mom would. So how would she express that? Like asking those kinds of questions allows me to learn a little bit more about the character, I think. For first language, my daughter's name is Emma Byun, and her best friend's name is Emily Byun. And so Emma Grace Byun and Emily Grace Byun were like best friends since kindergarten. And one day Emily told Emma while she was in the backseat of my car that every time her mother had texted me, Emily, had actually written the text because her mom was nervous about her grammar. And so when I heard that story, I was like, I've known this woman for so many years. We've had so many conversations. Our daughters have slept over each other's houses, and all this time she didn't feel comfortable texting me, another Korean American, because she had come to the States late. And so she felt her English wasn't strong enough. That gave me the voice for first language. So sometimes, like when I tried to pick up on the voice, I would think, what would her mom say? Or how might she say that? And I would kind of riff on that a bit to be able to access that. And then my favorite thing possibly about the Beg is that at the end of first language, the language actually just turns into Korean. So in the beginning, when I'd first submitted the manuscript, I actually phoneticized it in English, like what was actually being said. And late in the editing process, I was like, let's just put it in the Korean language. Like, let's just create a moment that's inaccessible to any other reader. It's like, what would that look like? It just felt like the right thing to do. And yeah, to Knopf's credit, they never pushed back. They just asked me to check the spelling, and they published it in that way. So yeah.
Yeah, it's done really beautifully. And as you said, I never felt like they're being caricatured. It was that this is part of who they are, and this is their language in a sense. So I thought they were done really, really beautifully, and really enjoyed reading that aspect of it, among many other things. But I was just wondering, did you grow up bilingual at home? I read that you came to the States at 3, so there are many Korean Americans who would probably not speak Korean if they came at their language. And I was just wondering, what was your relationship to Korean language was when you were growing up?
So I grew up hearing a lot of Korean. My parents aren't fluent English speakers, so they speak to me in Korean, even if I mostly might respond to them in English. In church, I had to sit through the Korean language service. So the sounds of that service are in my ear, I think forever. I have very little written Korean, meaning I can read it slowly, but I would not be able to write in Korean. And if I'm listening to like a news broadcast, there's a lot of vocabulary that I wouldn't know. So I could get around, I could order at a restaurant, but I probably wouldn't understand like, a political situation or something like that. So like passable Korean. It's like.
Yeah, and which is totally understandable. But also, what also surprised me, actually, in another story, Skinship, because the story begins in Korea. And your description of Korea is so vivid and so lived in that I had to wonder, like, did you live there later on? Like, I was just wondering, what was your relationship to Korea as well? But also, what was really refreshing to me was that this sense of the homeland or the motherland that you leave behind. It's not a myth. It's not romanticized. It's a very much lived in place, and it's a very specific, particular space for the characters, which I think a lot of people, when write about the motherland, the lost homeland, it tends to be a little bit mythologizing. But I didn't feel that at all when I was reading your book. So I was just wondering, how did you sort of depict Korea so vividly when you left it when you were so young? And what was your relationship to Korea as you were growing up?
So after I left Korea, I went back a handful of times in the summer. I think a lot of us have that experience. Like, I remember getting stopped at immigration because we had so many bagels in our bag, like a whole luggage bag full of bagels, which my aunt loved, peanut butter, like the Folgers coffee. I remember having gone back enough to see that there was a significant change in Korea. When I first went, kids on the street would just ask me to say a word in English, and they would think that is so cool. I remember seeing like chickens walking around. I was in a kind of outpost of Seoul most of the time. And the Korea that I experienced there was the Korea of like neighborhoods, right? Because I was visiting my parents' relatives. And so I wasn't touring, I was living in these neighborhoods. So I did that whole routine. Every few years you go to Korea for a vacation. And then I was there for a few months teaching English. This was when I was like probably in my early 20s. And that was a very different experience. And Korea had changed quite a bit by that time. It was a totally electronic nation by then. It was completely technologically advanced. Then I was there once during the time when Korea advanced in the World Cup. And I was there when they had all the people were in red and they were like crowding in the streets. So I was there briefly at that time. So yeah, a handful of times.
So when you think about Korea, it sounds like it's not a mystery to you. It's a lived in, alive place.
Yeah, I'm not. So we're going to Korea in a month. So I will let you know. But I do think, I'm not sure exactly how to explain this, but I think that when we were younger, meaning like my generation, and we would go back to Korea, we felt a connection to it through our parents, maybe, that we might not necessarily feel now. I think that there is a new Korea, a much younger, hipper K-pop Korea that has a very different relationship to America, which needs to be negotiated. So I feel that it would be very difficult for me to go to Korea and understand it the way it is now, or to presume to understand it, and its politics and its economic problems, social problems, and everything that it's doing well, in as close a way as I did maybe with my parents' Korea. So
yeah, because your relationship with Korea was through them, and
right.
That generation is, they're gone, they're getting older, and they're disappearing. And as you said, there's a new Korea, so it's always, we all have to negotiate that as we get older. But another thing that really struck me about is your depiction of marriage, or the relationship between husband and wife, and that's sort of the topic of the Church of Abundant Life and First Language, and obviously the art of losing in many ways. But there is a line, I believe it was in First Language, where she says, the American marriage is about talking and hugging, but that is not the Korean marriage. The Korean marriage is what? And that's literally what you wrote. And it really struck me. So, and I think it's also interesting because you're also talking about Korean marriage in the United States. It's the marriage between Koreans or Korean Americans in the United States. And for example, the Church of Abundant Life, the couple decides to immigrate together. In First Language, she is in a kind of a sort of the introduced marriage, or I don't like the word arranged marriage, because that's not really what it is, but she comes to the States to marry her husband who grew up in the States, and in order of losing, the couple find each other in the United States. So it's really interesting when you think about, so it's not the typical Korean marriage in that it's not marriage that's happening in Korea as a background. It's a marriage of Koreans and Korean Americans in America. So I was just wondering what you were thinking. And as I just described, they are all very different from each other. So I know there's not one answer, but what were you thinking when you said that line, the Korean marriage is what?
I don't know, but I actually don't think that my underlying interest is Korean marriage, like Korean American, or, because I think all those varieties exist in all cultures in the different types of marriages, right? So it's almost a loosely generational thing that you can say that certain couples are more matched, like arranged. Certain couples find each other through, it's the end of war, marriages of convenience. And then you have the younger generation like falling in love and making their own decisions. I think I'm really interested in marriage. Like as I get older and I see that we make these decisions in marriage, however we make them, however they're presented to us, and that becomes your fate, whether you stick it out or you don't, like good patches or bad patches, like the way in which that decision that you've made at a certain point in your life will continue to just play out in the journey of your life is so interesting to me. So for example, when I see elderly parents where, you know, for example, my father-in-law has a strange neurological condition now where he can't move very well, like the loss of his the use of his legs. And I see my mother-in-law like trying to get him into the wheelchair. That is like a 60-year-old marriage, which is beginning to come to its close in this sense, right? Or when I see my friends and talk about their marriages in a way that has a great deal more questioning, like more ability to inquire of the other person, a negotiating of commitment. Like I see that kind of thing happening. I see my friends who don't marry and how that affects, their life. So I think just as a short story writer, the opportunity to explore marriage is like, it's just full of so much human drama, I guess. Yeah.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of drama in there, but also, I mean, I do, that's also one of the reason people read short stories is that you just experience that drama and within a very confined space, confined length, but also there's always that sense of really well-written short stories. There's that sense of unpredictability that you thought the story was going this way, but then it ends it's completely somewhere else. It goes, or you just realize, oh, that's where it was going. At least for me, that's one of the best things about reading short stories. And there's a lot of that in your stories, that sense of unpredictability. And I thought also you really ended stories very well. So I was thinking, how do you choose to end your stories? Do you start with thinking that this is where it's going to go, or do you let them take you where it should go?
So I start never knowing where they're going to go. And about a third of the way in, I always feel like it's not going to go anywhere. And I'm depressed for a few days. And I always feel like I've got a better idea for a different short story. The beginning is always very difficult for me. And in finding the beginning, so if I have 5 pages, I might have written 30, just figuring stuff out. I think by the time I'm about 3/4 of the way in, I begin to feel the pull of the story's themes that I probably didn't put consciously. So I can begin to feel material gather in a way that I find very, what's the word? Like that's the good part of writing, when things are beginning to come together. It's a lot of it is subconscious. And so, yeah, I don't know. When I'm at the end, I know it's the end. When I'm in the beginning, it's a lot of just figuring it out. It's very murky, but as it comes to the end, I'm like, I know that this is getting close to the end, and then I can revise in light of that. I think I'm not, if you were to test me on this, I probably couldn't pass, but I think, Francis Ford Coppola once said about The Godfather that it has a one word, the whole series, The Godfather, has one theme and it can be contained in a word, and it was succession. That was his word. And I think if I look back closely on my stories after having written them, if I were called upon to come up with one word, which was the through line of the story and where the story lands at the end, I probably could come up with something. So for example, in the story about the 3rd grade girl, which moves to the point of her applying to colleges, she's sending out her applications. She wants to go to Yale or whatever. She's writing her college essays. That word for me is sophistication, because I think that that's what an immigrant does. You come, you learn, you become educated, you become sophisticated. And in that process, you also pull away, you get that distance from the people who have sacrificed to bring you there, right? So when I hit upon that word, it's like, oh, that's what the story's about. And that helped me to kind of edit it in light of that. And so, yeah, that's how the ending works for me.
I see. That's not the answer I was expecting. But speaking of the story about the younger, which is a map of simplified world, that's the story you just talked about, which I mean, it's hard to choose what is the favorite. I'm sure it's like, asking you to choose who's your favorite child. And even if you have one, you would never say which one it is. But I have to say, I really enjoyed probably enjoyed reading A Map of Simplified World the most, probably because it's point of view of a child, and there was this sense of her experience is not filtered, or that we're not looking at something that's that we have to think about or analyze. Like I could just experience her world as she was experiencing it. I don't know if that makes sense. So why choose a child's point of view when you're talking about this? And she's a very recent immigrant, I believe. Like she just comes to the States and she goes into the third grade or second grade, something, and then she also meets another a friend who is a recent immigrant. And by the way, the story is also set in Queens, which is the most diverse community in the United States, probably, when it comes to recent immigrants. So why did you decide to tackle immigration or the immigrant experience from that point of view?
So that also has a technical answer. I was speaking with the editor, Tom Jenks, and I was like, do you have any suggestion for, he published 2 of my stories in narrative, and I asked him if he had any suggestion for my writing. And he was like, why don't you try writing a story without backstory? And I was like, how do you write a story without backstory? Like the easiest way to do it is you start young. That way you just move forward chronologically. But I think the more meaningful answer is that immigrants have so much backstory in one sense, but young immigrants are pure chronology. They just move forward, right? They don't have the burden of that backstory. And so that story like kind of plows forward in time. It just starts going and then it just moves, and then suddenly it jumps. And I think that there was something I felt was true to one aspect of immigrant experience, which is that for younger immigrants, it's just the chronology of their life. That's just the way they experience life, as you said. And I felt that that was a perspective I'd want to have in this collection,
So I don't know if you've tried writing a novel, but I was just wondering, since your first book is a collection of short stories, and as you said, writing a short story is such a technically specific thing to do. So I was wondering, what do you think is the biggest advantage of writing a short story? And what would be the hardest thing about writing a short story?
So for me, you mentioned this before, and I think that there is something about the length of the short story, but particularly the long short story, which I think Alice Munro and other writers introduced us to, is perfect for this day and age, just because it's like, it's like the HBO series where the episode is like 50 minutes long, it's not like a movie, but it also has trajectory because you can have multiple 50-minute. I just feel like in modern consciousness, there is a space for the length of the short story. I mentioned this before, but Cheng-Rae Lee and he was my professor at Stanford. We called it the glass of wine short story, right? You have a glass of wine and you can experience what you would experience in a novel. I think Alice Munro showed us that there's nothing missing in that experience, but it's also contained in a specific, in like a manageable period of time. So yeah, I love the short story also because I often start novels and I lose them because there are just so many books going on in our household. So yeah, what's difficult for me about writing a short story are the beginnings, like making those commitments to those beginnings, and finding that beginning time and time again. And I think that's the hard part.
Mm. Well, you just mentioned Alice Munro, and because many critics and writers and readers have compared you to Alice Munro, which I would think that for a short story writer, there's no better compliment, because she really is the master of the form. But I was just, and I would imagine that you would have been very much inspired by her writings, as many people are. But I was also wondering, any other writers that you were inspired by?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think that so many of us, including myself, are so indebted to Alice Munro. And for a few things, it's not just story length, but I think it is her commitment to a very specific area and a specific individual, and her like complete commitment to articulating the voices of her people. And I think the third thing that Alice Munro does is she masters the way time can be used in a story in a way that I think unlocks a lot of potential. Somebody who was hugely influential to me was Chang-Rae Lee, because whenever his first book came out, it like my parents gave it to me and told me, you have to read this, and I didn't. But that was there. Even more than his novels, I think Chang-Rae Lee has a few essays, and when I encountered them, the reaction that I had really surprised me. There's an essay in which he talks about his mother's cooking in light of the fact that she has stomach cancer and she passes away. And every time I read it in tears, because there's something to me that was so gratifying about reading about that specific type of cooking in light of that essay, which I could have read from any other writer, but it's the kalbi and the way that she like butterflies it and marinades it. I felt in my reaction as a reader that I would want to, as a writer, be able to provide those same experiences for readers. So I think in deciding that my material would be Korean and Korean American, I think he was very informative in showing me the value of that, right? Yeah, so many other writers. And the other thing I really like, I like craft books. So I like read books on the art of description, the art of time, or like, George Saunders on the Russian short story, or, things along those lines.
I was just wondering though, do you feel like you might be, because you said also at the very beginning, when you were writing as a grad student, you didn't want to be limited, and or have known as somebody who just write about Korean American experiences. Obviously, you have many more stories to tell, I hope. So, and they may not all be Korean American stories, but do you ever feel like you're limited by being called a Korean American writer, or that dreaded word, the ethnic writer? Do you ever feel like you be pigeonholed into writing about immigrant experiences?
Probably, and then different conversations I've had with different, like in a college workshop, say, or stuff, I have had that question asked of me from students, sincerely. I guess my answer is I don't mind at this particular point now, because I think for two reasons. I think, Toni Morrison was talking about the fact that people asked her, why do you only write about Black people? And she had an answer which is a little complicated, but it has to do with our perception of neutrality, because all writing is ethnic writing, or it's all gendered writing. I mean, it all comes from a specific individual in a specific place. So when we read about Tolstoy's Russia, that's not neutral. That's Russia that he's writing about, and only Russians, right? And he's not writing about it with footnotes. He just assumes that the reader will be able to participate in his reality. And so she really kind of pushed back against the idea that the kind of writing she does is racially motivated, whereas, the white American male author is considered somehow just like a neutral space. But the other answer I have is, when I consider what's already on our bookshelves, like the books that exist here today, and it's changing a lot. There are a lot of new Korean writers and just all different types of writers now, but I feel that the contribution I want to make is pretty specific. So in terms of, my own interests and where my stories could go, I think that it is very meaningful to me to create for some young reader the experience that I had when Chang Wei Li wrote about his mom's kalbi. That's not like it might not be like a cool artistic thing to say, but just like in my encounters with like people who've read my stories and who have a connection with them, I think that I have a responsibility to that. And so, yeah, I don't know. I feel like I would just double down on that and not resent that label at all.
I think that's a great answer to a somewhat silly question. The Korean saying of the silly question and wise answer. So this is your first collection. So this is probably the first time many of our viewers are meeting you, and finding out about you. So I just wanted to ask you, did you always wanted to become a writer? What were you like when you were little girl growing up in the US? And as you said, there weren't so many representation of successful, whatever, Asian woman out there. But what made you decide that you want to become a writer, or what inspired you?
Yeah, I don't know that I decided that. I always read quite a bit. So my mom was very curator-like in our education. So it was just me and my younger sister. She's 13 months younger than I am. And so my mom only had the two of us. And all the time she would say, I don't have a son, and so you guys have to be better than a son, whatever that meant to her. So we had no TV. We just had a lot of books. And we read a lot. We read quite a bit. When we were moving a long time ago, I found an old journal in which I wrote, I'm going to be a writer, which surprised me because I don't remember actively thinking that at any particular point. But I did journal quite a bit too, just because she forced me to do that. She thought it would be good for my education. Yeah, I don't know how I became a writer, but I know that the author Richard Ford has said, and after his Pulitzers and all of his acclaim, he says he still kind of is hesitant to call himself a writer or to call writing his career. And the word that he used, which I particularly like, is he calls it his vocation. And he's like, it's not exactly who I am, and it's not exactly how I make money, but it's just kind of what I'm called to do, right? What I feel that it gives me fulfillment to do. And so, yeah, I found that, but much later in life, I think, is where I feel that writing gives me, we all love to complain about how much we hate writing, but actually I love it. So, yeah.
Well, and you must love it because I don't know if we mentioned, but in the beginning, but you have 4 children. We talked about how you had four children basically within 5 years, so very close to each other, and which anybody can imagine what a full house and what a full-time job that really is. So where do you find time to write? How do you keep that balance between being a writer and being a mom and, taking care of all your children and all that?
I know. There is no balance. There's only survival day to day, right? I mean, it's like you, right, with your laptop on the steering wheel, waiting for your daughter to come out of gymnastics. It's like right now, my husband picked up the kids from school and I can hear him trying to keep them quiet in the background. It just takes a lot of different sacrifices coming together. A lot of times the kids ate fast food rather than it's not all perfect and it's not all organized. And it just somehow comes together.
That's great. So I'm almost afraid to ask, when can we read more stories from you? Because I know how full your time is, but also I have to say, I can't wait to read more from you. So what will be next?
I'm working on something longer. And I think I have my character. So that's the most important thing for me, like who my character is. Yeah, like I said, doubling down on my identity. It's not really an immigrant story, but I do think, and this is my first time actually speaking about it out loud, so I might have to formulate my thoughts. Even my agent doesn't know, but I think that I really want to explore the consciousness of a certain kind of Korean American in the way that there are books that really do a deep dive into the consciousness of, like, for example, I'm thinking of Rabbit Run, the John Updike books, where you just get 3,000 pages of like Pennsylvania white man ex-basketball player, like, trajectory. So I'm not saying that it's 3,000 pages, but I'm just saying that investment in a very particular consciousness is super interesting to me right now.
And I can't wait to read it. So hopefully it will happen soon. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for tonight. So thanks again. And congratulations once again to Yoon for her debut collection. And we can't wait to read more from you. And hope everything is well, and best wishes to your family. Hope they all stay healthy. Thanks to Peter, our IT director, for making this live webcast a possibility. And thanks to our interns, Subin and Caitlin, for all their work. And we'd like to thank you, our members and viewers, for joining us tonight. Skinship is available wherever books are sold, but there is on our website, there is a link to purchase the book. So please check out our website for the link and all the other information about our upcoming programs. And make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel and like it so you don't miss any other programs. But thanks again, Yoon. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Jay. Thank you so much to Korea Society. Bye.